Hey there. Today I want to dismantle a mistaken belief that a lot of people used to hold about African countries. After 20 years of rampaging growth, this probably isn't an issue for most of this channel's audience, but a lot of people my age and older used to believe that Africa had some sort of special, unique problem when it came to economic development in the first decades of independence. Well, today I'm here to tell you that there was nothing unique or surprising about what happened to Africa in its first decades of freedom. It was the oil crisis, pure and simple. The post-World War II era can be divided pretty neatly in two. For just under 30 years, the price of energy was predictable everywhere, and it got predictably cheaper year by year. This was great for everybody. Japan and Europe experienced 30 years of extraordinary economic growth. The United States did too, even though we didn't have anywhere near as much war damage to bounce back from. This rich world expansion led to slow but steady gains in the developing world as well. It wasn't anywhere near as rapid as the China-driven expansion of the past couple decades, but it was significant. Everybody has commodities to sell, and during that post-war expansion, the selling was good. This reliable world of ever cheaper energy came to a crashing halt in the early 1970s. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 was the catalyzing event, but the fundamentals had been shifting for years. The easiest oil had been accessed, and demand kept growing. For almost 50 years now, the oil market has been incredibly volatile. Sure, there were periods of cheap prices in the 1980s and again in the late 1990s, and since 2014 we've had consistently somewhat low oil prices, but it hasn't been anything to rely on. It's the volatility that makes it almost impossible to plan anything and makes economic growth much harder, everywhere. In most areas of the world, we acknowledge how important this was. Most European historians believe that it was the oil crisis that ended their post-war expansion. It's not something that's typically spoken of this way, but in the United States, I think the best way to describe what happened after 1973 was regime change. The economic stagflation of the 1970s ended the FDR era and ushered in the Reagan era. If you're interested, one of my best videos of 2020 was on this American regime change. I'll link to it at the end of this video. The complete revamping of the US's economic model under Reagan did push the country forward, but there is a dirty secret nobody likes to acknowledge. Even when it was working at its best in the 1980s and 1990s, the Reagan model could never match the US economic growth rates of the 1950s and 1960s. So even the richest countries in the world had a really tough time dealing with the new era of uncertainty in energy prices after 1973. A couple countries in Northeast Asia were a special case that I'd like to talk about a bit more in the coming months, but the majority of the developing world got its ass kicked. Historians generally acknowledge the effect that the oil crisis had in Latin America. A fairly hopeful 1950s and 1960s in the region gave way to a nightmarish 1970s and 1980s, with multiple civil wars and a continent-wide debt default crisis. The role of energy prices in this chaos is always recognized. Maybe it's just me, but when it comes to Africa, I feel like nobody mentions that the oil crisis was incredibly significant for them as well. Over the past week, I've been reading this absurdly ambitious history of African countries in the post-independence era, and the oil crisis explanation has just hit me like a ton of bricks. I now find it shocking that anybody would try to discuss African underdevelopment without placing the oil crisis front and center. This book really brings home how staggeringly diverse this continent's 50-plus countries are. In the decades after independence, everything was tried. Many leaders were committed socialists. Some went whole hog for capitalism. Some leaders were dedicated and conscientious. A lot of them were greedy. Some were insane. Some countries started out with many advantages, and some seemed kind of doomed from the start. But no matter what the system was like, every story in this book seems the same. The hopes for development were all dashed by the same problem: oil prices that skyrocketed in the 1970s and an inability to pay for the energy necessary for growth. The economic development of African countries faces many obstacles, and many of the standard explanations are true to some extent. Weird borders, bad leaders, many countries that lack a coherent national identity, imperialism, all of these explanations make sense to some extent. But I often feel like people would rather scold Africans than admit that they got blindsided by the same crisis that blindsided everybody else. I think this eagerness to blame Africa for post-independence failures might have its roots in a really fundamental misunderstanding. I think a lot of people just assume that African countries became independent directly after World War II. This is true for most of Asia, and there were a handful of North African countries that did become independent in the 1950s, but most African countries didn't become independent until the 1960s and 1970s. The median African country gained its independence in like 1961, just 12 years before the 1973 oil crisis. So during those healthy economic decades after World War II, European imperialists were sucking up all the benefits that African countries should have been saving up. Most of Southern Africa didn't achieve independence until after the oil crisis era had already started. Very few African countries had much more than a decade to build themselves up before the beginning of the energy crisis era in 1973. Cheap energy prices are vital to every kind of economy, but the poorer a country is, the harder hit it's going to be by unstable prices. There are many other important explanations for the underdevelopment of African countries, but I think the oil crisis is the most important explanation, by far. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and let me emphasize how important it is that you click the bell next to the subscribe button to get notifications. YouTube will not notify you of new videos if you do not click that bell. Thanks.